I'm going to begin this message today with a question. Don't answer out loud. I want you to ponder it. What do you want people to remember you by? What do you want people to think of you? What outstanding, I'm asking the same question, attribute, whatever, talent, skill, thought. You think about these questions when things like job interviews come up. You want to put your best foot forward, share all the good things, but none of the bad. Social gatherings. We're always aware of what are people around me thinking. I mean, we're selfish, right? We can get to, what do they think about me? And all these different questions come up. Or when you're around family, or when you're out and about to share Christ with somebody. This question comes up of, what do people think about me? Now, I know some of you are already arguing, well, that's not the most important thing, and I agree with you, but this is why Paul uses this word foolish. Because he's having to share about his ministry and what's about him, and he doesn't want to go there because that's not the most important thing. And so we pick up an argument or a discussion that started last week. Let me just get a couple verses here. He says, I repeat, let no one think of me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. What I'm saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Now see, Paul's continuing what we read last week, and he keeps on saying, I'm being a fool, I'm being a fool. And so what is Paul doing foolish? Well, there's a proverb, and actually there's two proverbs right next to each other. Proverbs chapter 26, and I'm just going to put it up there. And it says this, answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. And so Paul has this in his mind, because trust me, he knew the word. And he's like going, if I start arguing and comparing and all these other things, then I'm going to be just like them. But then the next proverb, it's amazing. Sometimes the Proverbs make you scratch your head. Well, which one do I do? Answer a fool, wait, didn't it just say do not answer a fool? But answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. So there is a time and place that you need to say, hey, you're thinking this, and let me just show you that foolishness of a thought like that. And so this is that tension. And so he's just like, listen, I feel like a fool making this argument, defending myself. In fact, Jesus wouldn't do this, is what he's saying in verse 17. He continues in verse 18, since many boast according to the flesh, according to, what they do in life with this body, I too will boast, okay? If this is your measure, Corinthian church, of what's good and what's bad, all right, I'll step into this, because what a slam. For you gladly bear with fools, being so wise yourself. I mean, this is tongue-in-cheek sarcasm at its best. And so last week again, last week he joins the debate of defending his ministry and attacking those who had falsehood into the church. And so we looked at that last week. This week, he joins their comparison game. their comparison where, well, they looked at each other and says, well, I'm better than you at this, and I'm better than you at this, and they looked at Paul, and we're all better than you. And so they're doing this comparison. And so this passage, you're going to hear as we read through this passage over and over again, he's going, I'm being a fool. I'm like a madman making these arguments. But he's like I'm doing this to show their folly. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. And see, we looked last week. Paul was willing to play the fool because this is what was at stake. The purity of the church. The devotion of the church to Christ. The beliefs of the church were all at stake. And then he goes into the next verse and says, now here's another thing that's going on and why I can't just let this go. He says, for you bear it if someone makes slaves of you. Because that's what these teachings would do, would enslave them, or to devour you, or take advantage of you, or put on airs, or strike you in the face. And he's like, okay, I'm not that strong, okay? To my shame, I must say, we're too weak for that. We're too weak to manipulate you, to actually abuse you, even physically. And you're like going, what? How? And again, I had that same question of what these leaders in the church with their falsehood was bringing. He mentioned slaves he addressed the Galatian church and talked about how the Christians were put back into the slavery of having to live by the law. The word devour there, is like the imagery of a parasite that just feeds on the host. And these false leaders have come in and they're feeding off of you, and again, just this, whether spiritual or emotional or even physical abuse was all a part of this. And he's going, you guys are putting up with this. I've got to say something. I've got to go. And if I have to compare myself with them, then so be it. And it's what he says. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I'm speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast. So I'm getting ready to compare. I'm going to compare. So we're going to look at a couple ways he compares, and then just again, go back to that first question. What do you want people to remember you by? So here he goes. First of all, he compares his heredity. He compares his heredity. He says, are they Hebrews? Now Hebrews was a heredity thing as well as something else. It was a language. And in Paul's day, even in the Jewish circles, you had some looking down at others, and this is why they looked down. You had those who were more in the Palestine area and Israel area, and they all spoke Aramaic/Hebrew. But then you'd go to the outskirts where Jews were all over the world, and they all spoke and raised to speak Greek. In fact, that's one reason why there was a Greek translation that many of the Jews had to have, because they didn't know Hebrew well enough and stuff like that. And so you had all these purist Jews that were going, well, you don't even know the scriptures, in your own language. I mean, come on, didn't you know it was written in 1611? Anyway, sorry. So are they Hebrews? Well, so am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. And again, this goes back to heredity, but it also goes back to nationalism. It's like, listen, I'm all for Israel, and yes, they're God's chosen people, and yes, God has a plan. And read Romans, chapter 9, 10, 11, and you'll hear all about what Paul has to say regarding the future of the Israelites. Are they offsprings of Abraham? Now we're going biological. I mean, yeah, I can trace back to Abraham. And so he's comparing his heredity and saying, if this is your measure, I'm there. But when Paul writes about heredity in other places, he's like, it doesn't matter.
Sorry, Karen, I know you're really big on genealogy, and I am too. It's like, wow, yeah, I was this, and I was this, I was German, I'm English, I'm a mutt. Anyway, but when Paul gets down to it, and he says to the Galatian church, there's neither Jew or Greek. It doesn't matter. There's neither slave or free. There's neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, even if it's not biological, heirs according to the promise. And so he compares himself, knowing that this doesn't matter. But if this is your measurement, I'll give you this measurement. I'm there. So am I. Well, then he goes on. He compares his service. And he compares it in many different ways. He says, and this is kind of first in a generic sense, and then it gets more specific. Are they servants of Christ? Well, I'm a better one. And again, he goes, I'm talking like a madman. This is not how I would like to argue, but I'm going to do it anyway. And then he says, and I put it ... because I want to try to say, what would you fill the blank with? Are you servants of Christ? I'm better, with far greater. Well, what would you think Paul would say? I'll just show you what he could have said. Paul could have said, I was trained under the great teacher Gamaliel. I mean, and every Jew back in his day would go, ooh, wow. I started churches, at least 10 cities. Ooh, I led thousands of people to Christ. I had the approval of James. Who's James? Jesus' brother, the leader of the mother church in Jerusalem. Ooh, wow, this is impressive. I have the approval of Peter. Peter? Yeah, the one Jesus left in charge. Ooh, wow, Paul. I perform miracles. I got this long list. I made somebody mute. I made somebody who was blind see. He could have gone on and on. This is where Paul could have said, hey, I'm a better servant. Look at all I've done. That's not what he does. Instead, he says, not with far greater in these things that I just said, but labors. Just to let you know, labor was not looked highly upon in the Greek society. With far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, often near death. And so he's like, okay, let me share how great service that I do. And he just starts going instead of all the things we would think. So he shares the bad stuff. Things that people of his day would call failures. You went to prison? You got punished? What'd you do wrong? So he goes into more detail. Physical punishment. He starts going through it. Now listen, this isn't like, a long time ago, and I saw the movie Jaws. Remember Jaws? We could all do the dun-dun. Okay, even if you never watched the movie. Okay, so there's a scene in the movie Jaws, and again, I'm not saying watch this movie. It's great because there's parts that aren't great. Where they're in the boat and they're all talking and they all start showing their scars. It's like, yeah, I got that one from a mackerel. I don't know what they said. Oh, yeah, that's when there was a tiger shark right here. It's talking almost piratey, and just like, oh, they're bragging back and forth of their scars and all the bad things that happened to them. This is not Paul's attitude, okay? He is actually sharing it to an unfriendly towards bad thing happening. In fact, this was one of the things that the opponents of Paul at this church were saying, it was like, look at all the bad things happening to Paul. God couldn't be blessing him. And so what does Paul bring up as his defense of his great service? All the bad things. And so he talked about physical punishment. Punishment, not just bad things happening, but he gets punished, meaning he did something wrong. Well, let's hear about it. 5 times, not just once, not a couple times.
I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. Now, a punishment that was allowable in the Old Testament for punishing was 40 lashes. Now, the Jews thought, let's be a little gracious and let it be 39. Okay, just in case we miscount, because they felt if someone did 41 lashes and the person died because of the trauma, that person who administered the punishment would be guilty of murder. But if it was 39 and they died, they'd be okay. I'm not saying I agree with this. I'm just saying this was the mindset back in their day. And so they're like, so I got punished with 39 lashes 5 times. 5 separate times. I mean, and it's just like, wow, what did you do wrong, Paul? And again, I'll just let you know right now, all this stuff, you can't find all these things in the book of Acts. This is beyond what's already mentioned in the book of Acts, And so he got Jewish punishment. He got punished by the Jews. Well, then he says this, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Well, that's a Roman punishment. So I got in trouble. I did bad things, according to them, from the Jews. And also the Romans thought I did bad things, and so they struck me with rods. It's like, Paul, what's wrong with you? Once I was stoned. Now this is capital punishment. You know what that means? That means punishment that should end with the person's death. That person's done something so wrong that they should die for it. We have the record in the book of Acts when he went to the town and they didn't like what he said and they threw stones. And the point was you throw stones until they're dead. And they thought he was. And he probably would have, except for God's miraculous hand of healing. And so he's like, all right, here's my service. I get in trouble a lot. He goes on. Various dangers. Various dangers. First of all, we have travel dangers. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Now, this is before the Acts account of his shipwreck, so he has even more to come. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and day I was adrift at sea, going on. I went on frequent journeys. I'm always on the move, and in that always being on the move, I'm in danger from rivers. Every time I had to cross a river, it was a dangerous thing to do back then. Dangers from robbers. They were always getting travelers, and so here's these travel dangers, personal dangers, where dangers from my own people. The Jews is what he's talking about, that they're out to get me. Dangers from the Gentiles. Okay, if you're not Jewish, you are called Gentile. So that's everybody else. He's like, I'm in all of these dangers from every type of person, that I have danger. There were locational dangers, him being in different areas. We already, if I'm in a city, I'm in danger. If I'm in the wilderness, if I'm in a rural area, I'm still in danger. If I'm in the ocean, in the sea, I'm in danger. And then he says, and I'm in danger from false brethren. So even coming into the church assembly, I'm in danger. No matter where Paul went, he had a mark, a target mark. And you're reading going, okay, and this is your resume, okay. And he goes on and just starts talking about physical hardship. Physical hardship. He says, in toil and hardship, again, to a society that frowned on physical work. In toil and hardship, through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in the cold and exposure. And Paul's just saying, this is the life that I'm living, and he's, again, just saying, this is my service. And this is what it leads to. Constant stress. Do you have anybody here have a stressful job? Feel free to raise your hand. Do you have stress? Do you have stress?
Or I saw a little hand just, I don't know anybody. Okay, well, you remember the curse? You will by the sweat of your brow. Okay, just remember that. There's stress a part of everything. There's stress with jobs that you don't get paid for, right, moms? So it's constant stress. He says this, and apart from other things, apart from me being in danger all the time, and people out to get me all the time, and all these being away from home all the time, all this stuff, and apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches, that I am constantly struggling, and I'll use the word worry, concerned, burdened for what's going on in the church. This is why he's writing this letter to them, because he's burdened for them. Who is weak and I'm not weak? Who's made to fall and I'm not indignant? It hits me. It's personal to me, Paul is saying. He has a pastor's heart. And that's his comparisons. Look at me, I'm always in trouble. Look at me, I'm always in danger. Look at me. It's like, why did Paul share his weakness? Well, he answered this in an earlier passage, and I'll put it this way. Our boast is in the Lord. Paul's saying it's not in Paul. It's not what I do. This is me doing. I get in trouble. If it's what we do, all we have to offer is weakness. As Jesus said, apart from me, you can do nothing. And so Paul says, if I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who's blessed forever, knows that I'm not lying. And then he starts going to this thing. He says, at Damascus. He gives us specifics. What happened at Damascus? Don't stop reading. At Damascus, Paul went as an emissary of the Jewish leaders to go and persecute believers. And as he left Jerusalem full of pride, full of credentials from the Jewish leaders saying, this is our man, do what he says, arrest what he says. He had power. He was a rising star in Judaism. He was both respected and feared. He would say, you want to see what success looks like? Paul, or actually Saul at that time. But when he left Damascus, as he left Jerusalem, it says the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. I mean, here's Paul's big story. I tucked tail and ran. When it got crazy and dangerous, as I began my Christian journey, I hid away undetected. Now, I don't know how many people are bosses or HR people. I know one of them, or people who've hired people and stuff like that. You have this thing called a resume. You ask, they fill out an application, but they also send a resume. What do we put in a resume? Well, one, we exaggerate our strengths. Yes, we do. We're honest, how can that sound a little better than what it really is, okay? We exaggerate our strengths and we hide our weaknesses.
I mean, imagine a resume. Here's the top 10 jobs I've been fired from. Or here's the top 10 tasks I'm terrible at. No, you wouldn't do that. But this is what Paul does in his comparison. Because his boast is not in himself. His boast is only in the Lord. He doesn't want to say, this is what Paul did. He wants to say, this is what Jesus did. And the other reason, why did Paul share his weakness? Because Paul's desire is to know and be like Christ. His desire is to know and be like Christ. He shares with another church, Philippians 3:10. It says, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. Now, if you stopped right there, it would kind of sound like all of us. Yeah, I want the power. Woohoo, look at the power, look at the power. You know, stuff like that. And the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, becoming like him in death. Hey, is that on your desire list? Yeah, I want to suffer for Christ. I want to die for Christ. I mean, to be honest, you know, I want to go to sleep and wake up in heaven. You know, that's my desire. I have no choice in the matter, you know, and stuff. But you know, he's like, I so want to know Christ. I want to know everything about him, even the bad things that happened to him. This is Paul's desire, but it's also God's desire. What? Yeah. Romans, right after the Romans 8:28, all things work together for good. You know. Okay, he says, for those who God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. God's desire for you is to make you like Jesus, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. But what was Jesus like? We go back to Isaiah 53. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him. No beauty that we would desire him. He was just your average Joe. Didn't stand out in the crowd. Unlike all the depictions of Jesus in every movie and every special that you've ever watched, he's always a head taller and he's always wearing this white thing with the blue sash. Okay? That's Jesus and all that, and he's always handsome or whatever. I'm not a good judge of that. You know, but the Bible just says, listen, you looked at him, there was nothing special. He was despised and rejected by men. A man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray. We've turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. What was Jesus like? Humanly looking at him, nothing special. You look at his life, and in fact, this is why so many people despise the cross. They're saying, what a failure. He ended by getting murdered. Paul's saying, I want to be just like him. And so I'll gladly boast of my weaknesses. Because it was in God's foolishness that his wisdom is shown. That he was weak so we could be made strong. I don't mean physically, I don't mean emotionally, I'm talking about spiritually. We were bankrupt, and Jesus took on our sin. So when we believe on him, we could have forgiveness and his righteousness. And so Paul's desire is to know and be like Christ. And so I end with the same question. What do you want people to remember you by? There's wonderful things to be remembered. Oh, what a wonderful mom. Oh, what a wonderful dad. What a wonderful husband. And I'm not saying those are bad or wrong. But for Paul, and it should be for every believer, I want people to remember not me, but Christ in me and through me. Let's pray. And Jesus, help us to realize that unlike some of the messages that are out there today where, God is wanting you to be healthy, wealthy, and wise, and all this other stuff. And it's like, God, you want your son to be shown in our life. And sometimes that means going through hardship. Sometimes it means we are not getting our way. God, I pray that you would work on us, that we would grow to have a heart like Paul, to be like you, Christ. To join you, Father, because this is your desire for us. That we would strive in reading our Bible to know you more and to be more intimate with you in our times of prayer. That we would assemble with one another and fellowship one another to know you more through other believers. To share you with others. Even when that means we get maybe some of that persecution. So I pray that every believer that's in this room and maybe watching or listening later, that it would be our prime desire to be known not for who we are, but for who you are, Christ. That they would see you through us. And if you are not a believer today, I pray that you are seeing what Christ did for you. That though he owned all, he gave it up so you could be saved. Would you trust him today? To this end that I pray, that you are lifted up, Jesus, and all men are drawn to you. I pray in your name. Amen.